So guys, welcome back to the YouTube channel. For this month of May, Mental Health Month, I've been doing mental health themed videos. And here at the end of the month, I thought I would give you something a little bit different, a little bit off the beaten track, something you guys may not be aware of. So today I'm joined by the lovely Jude Stevenson, who was one of my lecturers at Glasgow University, and her specialist area of study is Trichotillomania. So Judith, I'll hand over to your expertise, and could you briefly explain what this mental health condition is?
Hi David, thanks very much for letting me talk about this. So trichotillomania is one of a few conditions that fall under the umbrella term of body-focused repetitive behaviours. Trichotillomania is the irresistible urge to pull out one's own hair. Typically, people report a craving or an urge prior to pulling, and after pulling, they often feel some kind of relief or gratification. I think what's important to point out is there's two different types of pulling, and as research is coming on, people are reporting they engage in both. The first one is automatic pulling. And this is when people don't realise they're doing it. They can be driving their car, they can be sitting in a seminar, they can be in the pub talking to their friends, and suddenly they realise they have hair in their hands. This one's particularly problematic because if you don't know you're doing it, how can you try to stop? The other type is focused pulling, and this is when people really do report the urge prior to. Typically, people report more negative mood states, maybe anger, stress, sadness. However, there are some people who say they just feel like a good pull and they feel good afterwards. Now, I briefly mentioned this was one condition under the umbrella of BFRBs, body-focused repetitive behaviours. The well-known sister condition in our community is compulsive skin picking, which follows the same patterns, except people can't resist urges to pick at their own skin.
Right. Okay. So with the automatic and what was the other kind of focus? Yeah. Has anyone found out what the difference is between the two? Is there anything different that goes on in the brain or something like that?
We are still working on that, and what's particularly interesting is very loud motorbike. Did you hear that motorbike? Okay, going back to your question, David, are there any differences in automatic and focused? Most hair pullers and skin pickers report that they engage in both types. Okay. Very few hair pullers are just automatic or just focused, and I think this shows the complexity of the conditions and how much we still have to learn.
Yeah, definitely. So you've mentioned skin picking a couple of times. Is that always found with trichotillomania, or are they found separately more often than not?
These are two separate conditions, but they share very similar patterns. However, the comorbidity between the two is higher. Whereas if you meet a person with depression, they are probably more likely to report a comorbid diagnosis of anxiety than the regular person on the street. Like trichotillomania or skin picking, you're not guaranteed to have both, but you're more likely to run into someone who might have the additional diagnosis as well, or the additional behaviour.
Got you. So speaking of comorbidity, that's a psychology buzzword for the lay viewers out there. Basically, that means if you have two separate conditions that you're suffering with at the same time. So like Judah said, you might have depression and you might have anxiety as well. On that note, is there any other disorders? I was doing a little bit of research on this myself before we did the interview, putting myself up, and I noticed that it seems to come under anxious disorders and compulsive disorders. Is there any other particularly strong relationships with other mental health issues?
Okay, yeah, it's always difficult to say if the person would actually receive a diagnosis. I'm going to mention something we'll come to later. Many people with a BFRB don't seek formal support because they are afraid to tell the professional they have it, okay? However, in speaking to many hair pullers and skin pickers, many of them report social anxiety, the fear of being seen, the fear of being noticed. If I turn this way, will the person notice my bald spot? If the light hits me in a particular way, will they see the scar that I have from picking my skin? Obsessive compulsive disorder is another one that tends to be higher in people with BFRBs. However, not everyone has it. And you've also got depression rates as well, and anxiety. All these conditions are best friends, and they do like to hang out together. But I'd be really interested to see if everybody was to come forward to their GP and get the correct diagnosis, we would actually find out the rates much more accurately.
Yeah, just as you're saying that, I don't know if there's anything in the research, but the way you described it sounds slightly like body dysmorphia, that social anxiety, that fear of, are people going to see the way that my body looks like? Is there anything in the research that suggests those two are linked as well?
I think this is really interesting, and this is where one has to be very careful, and where it's up to us. What you're doing, David, this is wonderful, raising awareness. It's up to us to point this out to people who still don't know. I know that a lot of people with body dysmorphic disorder do pick their skin, but it's for a different reason to why people with skin picking pick their skin. Mm-hmm. Whereas I do believe, and maybe you can correct me, people with BDD see an imperfection that they fixate on and they want to improve it. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
People with a BFRB simply cannot resist the urge. It feels good. It feels gratifying. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like the behaviour is the same, but the motivation for it can be somewhat different. However, going back to our previous point, I would not be surprised if many people with BFRBs also do show some body dysmorphic disorder symptoms as well.
Cool. I'm going to drag this one out for all it's worth in terms of comorbidity.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering, the way that you've been describing the after effects of when you've pulled the hair or picked the skin sounds a little bit like the way someone who self-harms feels after they've done the self-harming. They have that irresistible urge before self-harming, and then after the act they feel that kind of rush and release of relief, and they've resolved that anxiety or stress that they had. Is that a similar pattern that follows in trichotillomania?
I'm so glad you asked this question. Is it self-harm comes up quite a lot, and the answer is no. Okay, so let me talk you through a typical hair pulling cycle. Now again, this is very interesting. What I'm going to tell you is going to sound very specific. However, the majority of hair pullers will talk you through the same thing. So if it's a focus pull, people can feel any emotion prior to pulling. They can be, I spoke to one girl who was at the World Cup final in the pub. She was excited. She was cheering on the team, and the cherry on top was having a good hair pull while she was watching those goals at the end, you know. Whereas you've got someone who might be feeling upset and they feel like pulling. So already you can see a slight difference there with self-harm. Mm-hmm. Typically, the person will search out a particular hair that feels interesting. It might feel a bit thick, a bit wiry, and they will search for a particular hair. And once they find it, they'll already be thinking, what does the root look like? After extraction, majority of people examine the root. If it's wet and juicy, if it's dry. Mm-hmm. And then very commonly, people will rub it across their lip. Okay, these are what we like to call rituals. Okay, and the majority of hair pullers do go through this. They very rarely just take the hair and discard it. Something that's a bit more severe is trichophagia, which is when people ingest the hair and swallow it after hair pulling. The majority of hair pullers don't do this, however, some do, and this can lead to trichobezoars in the stomach, which can result in surgery, as of course hair does not digest. So if anyone is watching this and ingests their hair, please seek treatment. There's lots of support out there for you.
Got it. Well, that's a fascinating insight into it. It's clear that you just, with all mental health issues, you can't just pigeonhole these things. There's so many extra dimensions and idiosyncrasies. So now that the viewers have a better understanding, can you outline what are the kind of everyday concerns that someone with this condition is going to have?
Yeah, so I just came back from the international conference on BFRBs in Dallas, and I was lucky enough to be in the presence of 500 people, loved ones, sufferers, clinicians, therapists. I will get to your point. I just want to mention this. So many people were running around with bald heads and patchy heads and bare faces and open wounds, and they didn't care. And they said, these are my 3 days of the year when I can show this and no one's going to judge me. Mm-hmm. So that takes me back to your question. What is the daily life like for someone who has a body-focused repetitive behaviour? One wakes up in the morning, and if one has done damage to their appearance, for example, they have a bald patch, they have pulled out their eyelashes, they have a wound, they go through rigorous effort to cover this. There's sprays called Topic that you can spray in your hair to darken the scalp. Some people go through lengthy camouflage on their face. Many people get their eyebrows tattooed on, or they spend a lot of time applying fake eyelashes. A hot sunny day, which we're not so familiar with here in Scotland, but many people are. Many people with scars will constantly wear long sleeves and long trousers, even if they're melting, because they want to hide the damage they have done. So that's definitely the first one, trying to hide this behaviour from others, because it's a very shameful, isolating condition. You've also got fear of relationships. If one is upset about being noticed, it's not unknown for people to have never had a relationship until an age that is later than most people, because this involves intimacy and being close to someone, and the fear of that being seen by someone who you want to be in love with can be very frightening and intimidating for many people. Mm-hmm. That's just two of many things that people with BFRBs come into contact with every day.
So I found your first point interesting. It was one that I expected, but in light of what we've been talking about, the shame factor, obviously you want to hide what you're doing, like most people with mental health condition want to hide whatever it is they're doing, whatever dysfunctional behaviour is. But going back to what we were talking about slightly earlier in the interview, where you were saying that often positive emotions are linked with the behaviours. So how do those two marry up to on one hand, expressing the behaviours through a positive medium, but also there's the shame element on the other side?
Complete and utter conflict would be the only response to that. It's a vicious cycle where one can engage in a pulling or picking spree that can last for hours. People often talk about the trance where they zone out. It's almost like being dissociated while they're picking or pulling. They go to bed and they wake up in the morning and they just feel, oh my goodness, what have I done? And I think this is another really important aspect. These behaviours that people are doing to themselves, although they can't control it, they're doing it to themselves. And if they feel they can't control their own hands, this can leave someone feeling very helpless when just the night before they were zoned out enjoying this behaviour. And this also creates the fear of other people finding out. Whereas many mental health conditions, although still stigmatised by many, do get attention. Many people have said to me, why don't they just stop? They're doing it to themselves. And it's really important to understand that this is a challenge that is so hard for people with these behaviours.
Yeah, I like that last point that you finished on. I think the bigger disorders like your depression and anxiety, they're kind of sorry, had a little slip up on the internet on my end there. What was I saying? Oh yeah, I was talking about depression, anxiety. There's more understanding of, there's something going on neurologically in these conditions. It's hard for the person. They can't just, think themselves happy or think themselves calm. But with this condition, it seems to be quite all in the hands, and the lay person, someone who doesn't understand the condition might say, well, why don't you just sit on your hands, or like tie up your hands, or put gloves on your hands or something. But obviously mental health, it all comes back to what's going on in the brain, what's happening, with the neurons and the deep pathways. And it's not that easy. You can't just stop yourself from doing these things. So that must be hard for a sufferer, because they maybe don't have the type of disorder where they can more easily convey understanding to someone else. They say, I'm depressed, I'm anxious. They'd say, oh, I just pull my hair all the time. It sounds almost trivial compared to the others, doesn't it? So that must be quite a hard stigma.
You've raised two really important points there. The first one being depression and anxiety. Every single person in the world, imagine them as a sliding scale. Mm-hmm. Everyone's felt a bit sad. Everyone's felt a bit anxious. Everyone can understand what it might be like to be depressed or anxious. Mm-hmm. Not everyone engages in hair pulling behaviours or skin picking behaviours. So therefore it's harder to empathise. Mm-hmm. I had a second point and I've just lost it. Oh yeah, I just remembered my second point. The stimulant cause of these conditions is with you 24/7. Mm-hmm. You cannot hide from your skin. You cannot hide from your hair. Yeah. Whereas the alcoholic or the smoker can clear out their home and have to make a trip to the store. Mm-hmm. People have their hair and their skin with them at all times. How do you hide from that when you have the urge to pull?
Yeah, that's funny. I've volunteered for a couple of years with an eating disorder group, and they have the exact same thing. They often say, I wish I could be an alcoholic, or I wish I was a smoker, because you can do the all or nothing approach to those. You can just cut them out of your life, but they're like, we have to eat. You know, we face our fears multiple times a day, and it's going to be exactly the same with sufferers of trichotillomania. Mm-hmm. So let's move on, and I want to know, what is your personal interest in this? Why did you start looking into this condition?
Okay, I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible, but at the same time, I think it's really interesting to tell you. So when I was 6 years old, and I'm 36 now, so that's 30 years ago, I started pulling out my eyelashes, and I never stopped. So I was born in 1979. There was no internet back then. Yeah. GPs didn't know what this was. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine what people thought when they saw a little girl doing this to herself. And it wasn't an easy time, and if there's no treatment and it's so self-gratifying, a little child cannot fight these urges. Around about the age of 15 or 16, while still pulling my eyelashes, I moved to my scalp, which I still do to this day, but I'm blessed that I do it from underneath here and not here. And then around about my early 20s, I also thought, hey, eyebrows, do you want to join the party? And I moved on to them. So yeah, I'm a multi-regional hair puller since the age of 6. And it's never left me. And this is why it's so important to give hope to people that life can continue with this.
Are you just a hair puller? You don't do the skin picking as well?
I'm just a hair puller, yes. Oh. I skin pick like any regular person. If I get zits, I'm like, come on, I'm in my 30s. Why am I getting zits? But as soon as I pop the zit, the urge is gone. Yeah. So I only pick to the same degree as any other person would without the condition.
Uh-huh. So does your experience of the feelings you get before a hair pulling, during the hair pulling, after hair pulling, do they seem to reflect what's coming up in the research, or do you feel your experience? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's so homogenous, the experiences that people talk about. At the conference, for example, every year, these are people many people you've met, but many people are new to the conference. You've never seen them before. They're from Oregon and Oklahoma and Florida. And you're at the bar and you sit down and you see them wearing the label, and it's like hair puller or skin picker, hair puller. And you start talking to them and you're like, yes, yeah, yes. And within minutes, you're just like sitting yesing to each other because you've got the same experiences. And you don't need to get to know each other because you're already connected by this club. Yeah. Not the coolest club. And we all know each other. We all experience the same things. And it's like a huge family. So yeah, it's very representative of how we all feel, definitely.
That's really interesting. With your bigger disorders, your depressions, your anxieties, that isn't always the case. You've got, your broad symptoms of a particular disorder, but everyone has a slightly different manifestation of that. Do you think with this condition then, because it's so generalizable and everyone has such a similar experience, do you feel that, I hate to use the words curable, as if it's, like a dirty disease or something. But do you think you can get to the root of this and just be able to completely combat it psychologically or medically?
First of all, I love the fact you said, can we get to the root of this?
Oh, I didn't even mean to do that.
I would like to maybe, if you can hold that question, I would like to rewind just to set some scene here. Although every hair puller and skin picker to some extent has the same experience, there are still many differences. For example, the focus, the automatic. Trichotillomania has now moved into a whole new category in the DSM. Skin picking was only just recognised in the DSM-5 2 years ago. Things are still moving, things are still being understood. I fully believe that 20, 30, 40 years down the line, the current classifications are going to be different. These are very under-researched, okay? And as they learn more, I think these will continue to change. I think even maybe different types of hair pulling, your focus and automatic, could potentially be moved into separate categories. And I can't wait to be an old lady in my rocking chair, knitting, thinking, wow, I witnessed this.
Yeah.
So you asked about the treatments. This is a very difficult one because you're asking someone to stop a behaviour that they actually to some extent enjoy. It's like asking someone to stop eating their chocolate.
Yeah.
Although the aftermath is extremely physically and mentally damaging, many people say if they could take a magic pill, if they could pull or pick and then take a magic pill and wake up the next day and everything's back, they would pull or pick forever. Whereas there are some people who just want to get rid of the urge and get better. So until now, there's been a lot of talking therapies, cognitive behavioural therapy. It's not so bad. It's good at dealing with the self-esteem issues.
Right.
Many people have realised they're probably never going to stop. So let's tackle the self-esteem. Let's tackle the perfectionism. Let's tackle the self-anger. You've also got habit reversal training, which has shown some success. However, many patients do relapse after 12 or so weeks. There's one treatment called N-acetylcysteine, which is an amino acid that you can find in most health shops, abbreviation NAC. And in 50% of hair pullers and skin pickers, the urges have reduced significantly, and people have really reduced their picking and pulling. Again, only 50%, not everyone, showing how heterogeneous the conditions are. But this has all happened in the last 15 or so years, and it's so exciting to see the baby steps, but in my eyes, the giant steps as to what is ahead.
Yeah, definitely. It's like everything in psychology, isn't it? We find a new therapy or we find a new drug and it works, and then suddenly it starts tailoring off and people start relapsing, and there's drug resistance and there's therapy resistance, and it's just a constant struggle and a constant education. The science kind of has to stay ahead of the mind and the brain and what's going on for people, and that's one of the reasons I love psychology, because I think we're always growing as practitioners. We're always constantly striving to get ahead of the mind, and the mind is such a clever, complex thing that it keeps on beating us. In that explanation you were given, you talked about some traits. You're talking about the self-anger and the perfectionism. Are there a cluster of personality traits that seem to manifest more, or sufferers of the condition seem to have on a more frequent basis?
Most definitely. Dr. Nancy Couthen, who is based at Massachusetts General Hospital, published a study very recently using the Big Five, and surprise, surprise, neuroticism came up as a winner in people with BFRBs. They were also not so inclined to be extrovert. I think I might be a bit of an outlier there. So these were the two main ones that came up. Also, maladaptive perfectionism. Perfectionism's not that bad if you're using it constructively, but people with BFRBs set really high targets. They can go for 10, 20, 30 days without picking or pulling. They pick or pull once and they can crash. Whereas one would see that as progress. We need to work in the maladaptive aims, I think, definitely.
So speaking of research, let's stop talking about other people and let's talk about you. What research have you done? What things have you found out, and how have you progressed the advancement of knowledge in this regard?
So there's not very much going on in the UK here, which at times can feel quite sad, but at the same time makes me feel really proud that at Glasgow we are trying to make a small dent. So I've been looking at something called attentional bias. So just to set the scene very briefly, if I was to show a table to somebody with an alcohol problem, and on that table there's a cup, a pen, a laptop, a wine bottle, a notepad, etc., they're going to notice the wine bottle, okay, because it's salient to their addiction. Mm-hmm. Whereas people who don't have an alcohol problem, they would notice it, but maybe not immediately. So attentional bias theory kind of goes along the lines that if we are attending too much to a particular stimulus, is it maintaining it? Because we can't get our attention away from it. Mm-hmm. So I've been using paradigms that are typically used in OCD, anxiety and addictions to see if people with trichotillomania do have this attentional bias to hair-related cues. We started off using language, linguistic cues. We didn't find very much there. We're now using images now, and the results are showing that once a person with hair pulling disorder looks at a hair-related image, they have trouble disengaging from it. It's not that they're looking at it too quickly, but once it catches their attention, they struggle to get away. And this is interesting because sometimes you don't always want to, you don't feel it pulling your hair or picking your skin, you think, just one. How about a wee treat, just one? And then they've pulled 10, and they've pulled 20, and they've pulled 30. Once they've started, they can't stop.
Right.
So we're just going along those lines to see if we can show similar findings in other conditions, if this will manifest in people with BFRBs.
Goodness me, my internet is terrible at the moment. Hopefully that'll be the last one of the interview. So yeah, the point I was going to make was people with the condition, they don't have that necessarily salient focus, but once they start, they can't stop. So what implications do you think that has for how we would approach devising a treatment?
Well, I think it's important to point out that 2 studies have been done here. The first one did not find a disengagement. I did, so we've actually found conflicting results. So I wouldn't like to say that that's a final finding, but to me it makes a lot of sense. I think the message would be, just don't start. It's so common for hair pullers or skin pickers to think, just one. Just don't touch. We have an expression, head up, hands down, because once that head's down and once those hands are up, it can be very hard to take them away. In terms of treatments, that's not so much the area I'm going down, so I don't know if I'm equipped to answer that question, but I think just on a more pastoral note, if you can just not start in the first place, if you don't have that overwhelming urge, just try really hard not to, because once you start, it's really hard to stop.
I think that's good advice for any dysfunctional negative behaviour, isn't it? Drinking, drugs, just don't start. So with all this in mind, with all the research we've talked about so far, what do you think is the most exciting development in this field? What is an area of the research that you really want to get behind and start progressing and moving on?
Well, the most exciting development is not something that I'm going to get behind, but would you like me to tell you about it very briefly?
Yeah.
Okay, so the TLC Foundation for Body-Focused Repetitive Behaviours, I'm just going to show you the information there.
Yeah.
Okay, they are trying to start, in fact they are starting brain precision medicine. Now this is a term that's becoming quite popular, taking bloods, identifying genes, etc., to try to stop it before it starts, to try to find a biomarker. Okay. Over the next 10 to 20 years, the Scientific Advisory Board, who do most of the research for the TLC Foundation, are confident that they can get to the bottom of this. Okay. We have a fantastic researcher named Dr. Joseph Garner, who's already looking at models in mice, and he's already found that you can actually predict when a mouse will start pulling its fur. And if we can just somehow lift some of these models and do brain precision medicine, we can effectively intervene before it develops. So this is something I won't be involved in. This is the wonderful Americans over at all the universities, but I'm very privileged to know them and to speak to them face to face and hear about this. So if you want to know more about the Brain Precision Medicine Initiative, go to www.bfrb.org and you'll find lots of resources on there.
Smashing. I'll get our website off you when we finish, and I'll put it in the video description as well, in case people didn't catch that. Yeah, I asked for something exciting, and I wasn't quite expecting that. That's what I love about science. That is incredible. The way that we can go right down to the the bare bones and get to the root of something. I'm gonna rehash the pun.
That's the issues together. I like to say that. I heard
That's incredible.
It really is. And there's such a small group of people. Like, all of the people involved in this fit into one room. This is underfunded. It's not something that a lot of larger pharmaceutical companies take seriously. The dedication that this group of excellent people have to this cause just blows my mind. It really does.
I mean, what is also really exciting about that is if they can do that with this condition, if they've got that expertise and going down to that molecular level, then are they going to be able to do that for other things, bigger problems, bigger concerns? That's some exciting stuff.
And we're going to be, hopefully, the generation that gets to watch this.
Yeah, incredible. So taking that wider holistic view in mind, let's move on for the last section of the interview. Talking about mental health in general, what directions do you think future mental health research should take in the next couple of decades?
Mental health research in general. I think that we are becoming aware that most mental health issues are neurological and possibly do have a biomarker, even if they are triggered by some sort of stressor. I think, like what's happening with the Brain Precision Medicine Initiative, I do think we might start to see more research going into the biomarkers. In terms of other research, it's not really research. We need to just raise awareness and show that these things are worthy of research. For example, trick and skin picking are really poorly underfunded. This question came up at the conference from an attendee who asked one of the doctors, and her response was, the funders just don't think that they are significant enough to cause impairment in daily life. Whereas someone with depression cannot go to work. People who pull their hair and pick their skin can go to work. What they often don't realise is that person might have dragged themselves in and they're fighting themselves inside. So I would like to see more about the effective correlates, how it affects the person, and really understanding just what's going on. And I want to walk down the street and to meet people and, hey Jude, what do you do? I study Trichotillomania. Oh yeah, that's right, I know what that is. Like it is with depression or schizophrenia. Usually people's eyes open really wide and glaze over and they'll say, oh, what's that? I want to see everyone knowing what this is because of awareness being raised.
Got you. I think there's two interesting points you raised in that. The first was about funding. I went to a conference last year and they were comparing cancer and mental health. So cancer, I think the prevalence rate is about 1 in 2 now. Number one, that's pretty scary. But the amount of funding that goes into cancer is incredible. There's loads of money put in it. Everyone recognises it's a big issue. Mental health conditions affect about 1 in 4 people. But the funding isn't half that of cancer. It's something like 1% or even less than 1% of the money that goes into cancer. And this is a huge problem. Like, cancer is a huge problem. Like, I'm not devaluing the effect of cancer, but the way that mental health just gets completely devalued in comparison, I think, is an issue that needs to be addressed, and I'm not too sure if that's an awareness thing or what the underlying issue is there. So that's the first point I was going to make. And then the second point, I really liked how you were talking about the comparison between depression and trick. You know, depression, somebody might not be able to go to work because of depression, but everyone's experience is subjective. Everyone's pain is subjective. So you might be going into work, but you might be feeling absolutely terrible. You're underperforming. You really don't want to be there. And I even know as a depression sufferer myself, I used to drag myself into class and make myself do the work. And I was actually quite a high functioning depressive. Like I was still doing well in all my endeavors, but I felt horrible all the time. And I think if people had an awareness of that, of the subjective experience of the person, I think that is another direction that we really need to make advancements in.
This is something I've covered in my level 1 lectures a few weeks ago in mental health. You cannot define suffering by how one copes. You cannot, because everyone's coping style is different. How do you define abnormality? Is it prevalence? Is it coping? There's so much we have to think about. And we're going down to first year material here. And still, these are things that we need to talk about to people. Very often these get forgotten about, for sure.
Yeah. So we'll finish up now with some personal tactics. How do you maintain as someone who has a mental health condition and, you know, all the extra stresses and strains of life? What do you do to maintain your mental health and emotional wellness on a day-to-day basis?
Okay, so be prepared for the cheese factor. So David, you know me, I'm pretty extrovert. I like to be around people. Support. Okay. I made the decision just a year and a half ago to come out and tell everybody I knew. Whereas I had told my close friends and family, I was living in fear of people realising I had this. Now, I'm not stupid. I know that people possibly picked it up, people noticed. But for me to stand up one day on Facebook and write a status, enough is enough. I want to get this out there, we can do this. The support I got back was amazing. I then got private messages from people saying, I have that too. Or people saying, I have an addiction. Can you and I keep in touch? Or I used to have an eating disorder. Support. It's so important. Sharing is caring. And I really feel that if we just talk about these things, try not to hide them if it's possible. Brené Brown did a wonderful TED talk on the power of vulnerability. Do you know David?
Yeah, I love that talk.
Whenever I watch that, it just makes the hair in the back of my neck stand up. Releasing my vulnerability was the best thing I ever did. And I think it's just so important to talk about these things and be ambassadors for mental health. Take it for the team, because we just don't know who we're going to help down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. I share all those sentiments. Similar experience myself, and my kind of passion and desire in this region is I hope one day someone can say I've got a broken ankle and another person can say I have a broken mind or whatever. You know, there's a portion of my brain that's not working and they're viewed exactly the same. You know, you wouldn't be embarrassed about a broken ankle. You wouldn't be embarrassed about bringing it up in conversation. You wouldn't be embarrassed about talking to people about how a broken ankle is impacting your life. And I hope the exact same conditions come for mental health.
Amen.
Yeah.
That's all I can say. Absolutely.
So Judith, I want to honour your time and thank you very, very much for joining us today and providing us with this insight into, you know, something that many people aren't aware of, but spread that awareness one video at a time, one conference at a time. So before we go, where can people find you on social media if they're interested in learning more?
On social media, I have a Twitter account which is GLS_79, or did I change that? I can be found on Twitter at Jude Stevenson. I believe people can probably find me via you. Also, just email me. I'm always keen to hear from people. Judith.stevenson@glasgow.ac And the best resource ever is www.bfrb.org, which is the only organisation in the world dedicated to sport and research. And we're trying to make noise.
Smashing. I'll get all those details off you and I'll put them in the video description. So for one last time, Judith, thank you so much for joining us today. And to the viewers, remember to love inwardly and shine outwardly.